Anyway, I want to wish everybody a good afternoon. At least it's the afternoon where I'm at. So just to introduce myself, my name is Albert Cheng. I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas. I study education policy, and it is 3 p.m. here, so right in the middle of the afternoon. So I want to welcome you to our session, our research track session entitled Parent Opinions and Decisions to Enter or Exit Homeschooling Before and After COVID-19. So I have here with me four researchers here who will be presenting their work. So I want to first introduce all of them before we turn the time over to them. So first we have Daniel Hamlin. Daniel is a assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He is a partner in crime with me. We both spent some time at Harvard together. But certainly his research examines the effect of school governance on measures besides test scores. Lots of focus on school climate, parental involvement, and student safety. There's a lot more I could say about him. I think for now, I'll just say that all of you should wish him a hearty congratulations. He just had his second daughter not too long ago, and is joining us fresh from the hospital, if I'm not mistaken. So next, we also have Emily Coady. And Emily Coady is currently right now at the University of Arkansas. She's working on her PhD in education policy here. She's originally from Rapid City, South Dakota, and has spent the last 10 years in education reform. Beginning in 2010, she was a Teach for America Corps member, teaching in rural Louisiana here, a fifth grade teacher, and also a long list of accomplishments in her role as a teacher, but also eventually as a leader in the organization as well, overseeing a lot of teachers. Also spent time in India and had lots of other escapades that I'm sure she's happy to entertain, but she was also here to present some work that she's been working on that we'll see in a little bit. Also, she is a student of mine, so anything great you see is certainly because of her, and anything that needs refinement is, you know who to blame right here. So anyway, welcome, Emily. Next we have Dorcas Ross, Professor Dorcas Ross from Bolivia. Totally enjoyed reading her bio. That's on the website at the GHEX conference website. She is a self-described voracious reader and fond of arts, loves outdoor activities, and has 3 children, lives in La Paz, Bolivia with her husband of 20 years. So bravo for making it there, and certainly a great example for all of us younger folks, I think. So certainly she's a published writer, written many articles on education, on homeschooling, and is heavily involved as a homeschool leader at the national scale in Bolivia. And so she's done plenty of work in coordinating actions across different homeschooling communities throughout Latin America and the United States. And so we look forward to hearing more about her particular work, more recent work coming out of the homeschooling and what's going on with COVID in Bolivia as well. And then last but not least, we have Drew Catt. Drew is the Director of State Research and Special Projects at EdChoice. EdChoice is based here in the U.S. Anything related to school choice, homeschooling included, they are a great resource. So I encourage you to explore that if you have not heard about EdChoice. So Drew works there, has done a variety of analyses on private educational choice programs, has done work serving private school leaders, parents of school-aged children, and has been there actually for, I don't know for how long now, Drew. It feels like it's been a while. But certainly you've certainly established yourself there and have produced a nice repository of work that has been well received or received by many others. So anyway, these are our 4 speakers, and I'm going to hand the time over to all of them. Just a few administrative comments here. I'm going to give each of the speakers 10 to 15 minutes to present their work. I encourage you, if you have any questions during their presentations, to please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and type your questions there. I'll give the presenters a little bit of time after their presentation to answer maybe some simpler questions that of clarification. We will save the deeper, more substantive questions to the end for our larger Q&A session. And so please put in your questions in the Q&A section. I believe also there's a way to upvote questions you want answered, and so please do that, indicate that, and certainly that'll give me an indication of which questions to prioritize. So with that being said, I want to give the time over to Dan, who will kick us off on some new research that he's been working on. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, I guess we should say research that we've been working on, since we're, I guess, as you put it, partners in crime on this one. All right, so again, my name is Dan Hamlin, and the study I'm presenting is homeschool trajectories and social isolation, a mixed method analysis. So I just thought I'd start out, I'll give you a quick overview of the whole study. So if you've been following homeschool research even a little bit, you know that one of the persistent concerns out there with respect to homeschooling is the idea that homeschooling is going to lead to social isolation in children, possibly depriving them of social skills, social experiences, relationships, social capital that might otherwise support positive life outcomes. And so in this study, we try to understand this possibility. And so we look at the relationship between the length of time that a child was homeschooled and really the length of time that an adult reports having been homeschooled as a child, and the association between that length of time and 3 life outcomes. And so the theory with that is that if homeschooling is a harmful practice that sort of has harmful consequences that extend into later life, then you might see that those who are homeschooled or get higher dosages, let's say, of homeschooling, they're homeschooled for a longer period of time, well, they would then maybe show more negative associations when you're looking at their life outcomes. We also did and are doing qualitative interviews. So the qualitative part is preliminary. We're working on that quite a bit at the moment. But we also do qualitative interviews with adults who are homeschooled as children for varying lengths of time to try to understand their perspectives on the influence of homeschooling on their social and life trajectories. So I'll give you the results really quickly as well, the broad results before I jump into everything. So we actually find little difference between the length of time that an adult reports being homeschooled and their life outcomes. So not much difference at all. And then we find some interesting, at least based on the preliminary qualitative interviews that we've done, we find some interesting selection mechanisms that might explain this lack of difference, let's say. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the study, but that's basically an overview of the whole thing. Okay, so the concept of social isolation is, I think, broadly characterized in the literature as having a lack of social interaction, a lack of peer networks, a lack of community participation, with community being sort of broadly understood. And if you look at the literature where scholars have used various proxies to assess social isolation, what you see is that these proxy measures for social isolation are associated with lower academic, physical, and socio-emotional outcomes in children. That's a fairly routine finding. I mean, most of these are correlational studies, but a fairly routine finding. So when we think about homeschooling, then, so a long-standing critique of homeschooling is that it's going to lead to social isolation, and that this is going to deprive children, and that this will have consequences later in life. But when you look at the literature that attempts to look at whether homeschooled children are sort of socially deprived, and whether their life outcomes suffer as a result, it's kind of unclear whether this critique is warranted. So if you look at the existing literature, in the existing homeschool literature, if you look at educational attainment, civic engagement, exposure to cultural resources, social adjustment, I mean, this body of literature, pretty much for the most part, reports positive outcomes for homeschooled children. And there's also a handful of studies that find positive outcomes for adults too, although that's a much smaller body of literature. Now, with that said, it's important to point out that most of these studies contain some pretty substantial methodological limitations. So they're mostly pretty modest descriptive studies. So think very small sample sizes in many cases, no controls at all in statistical work. So it's just kind of a bivariate relationship that researchers are looking at. Or in other cases, you'll see some of these studies are just in one single study setting or one single context. And so there's some limitations to this work. Another key limitation is that homeschooling literature, or homeschooling studies rather, often don't distinguish homeschoolers based on the period of time or the length of time that a child was homeschooled. So you might imagine that, you know, if the theory holds that homeschooling has these sort of social consequences and these life consequences, that those who are homeschooled for longer periods, well, they're gonna experience more harmful effects of homeschooling. And so this argument that homeschoolers are ill-equipped to kind of navigate society effectively, that may apply very differently to, say, a homeschooled, to an adult, let's say, who was homeschooled as a child for 1 or 2 years, versus one who did their whole K through 12 education as a homeschooled child. But I mean, this is sort of all theoretical. So there's been very few empirical studies that have even looked at later life outcomes of adults who are homeschooled. And then all of the existing work that's out there, for the most part, looks at homeschooling as sort of this static thing. So once homeschooled, always homeschooled. And it doesn't really make an attempt to look at variation based on the years that a child is homeschooled. So in this sequential mixed method study, for the first phase of the study, we look at survey data of adults who reported being homeschooled as children, and we ask the following question. So are later life outcomes for adults who are homeschooled associated with the length of time that they were homeschooled? And the 3 outcomes we look at are higher education, income, and marital status. I'll break those 3 outcomes down in a subsequent slide. In the second phase of the analysis, the qualitative portion, we are now conducting interviews to try to understand the influence of homeschooling on social and life trajectories. And so we asked the following question for this study: how do adults who are homeschooled for varying lengths of time perceive the influence of homeschooling on their social and life trajectories? And we also classify homeschoolers. So we have your short-term homeschoolers who are homeschooled for about 1 to 2 years, what we call substantial homeschoolers for about 3 to 9 years of homeschooling, and then long-term homeschoolers who had about 10 to 12 or had 10 to 12 years of homeschooling. So in the first phase, so that was the quantitative phase, you recall, we look at data from the Understanding America survey. And on that survey, there's 140 adults who reported that at some point during their K-12 education, they were homeschooled. And so we analyze data from that survey and look at these three binary dependent variables. So the first is household income. So if the respondent reported that their household income was 50,000 or higher, if the respondent reported that they had some college education or higher, and if the respondent reported being divorced or separated. Again, so the key independent variables are those classifications I just mentioned. So short-term homeschooling, substantial homeschooling, and long-term homeschoolers of 10 to 12 years. We use a fairly parsimonious set of, to put it mildly, a fairly parsimonious set of control variables. There's 140 adults in the sample, so that's sort of required in this case. But we try to select the ones that we think are most relevant, that may be most likely to coincide with the outcomes that we're looking at. So we look at gender, racial background, age of the respondent. Those are sort of essential for these analyses. And then we also use a proxy for childhood socioeconomic status. And that's whether the respondent reported that they ever attended private school at all as a child. So for the qualitative phase, and I think after this, I'm going to jump into the results, but for the qualitative phase, we've done 8 interviews so far. The hope is to do approximately 30 to 40 interviews, and we're doing them with adults aged 25 to 65 who reported being homeschooled as children for any length of time. And we're classifying them also using the same classification structure, the short-term, substantial, and long-term homeschoolers. And in interviews, they're about 30 to 40 minutes long, and we're asking them to reflect on their experience of having been homeschooled from a social standpoint, to try to understand how they feel that homeschooling may have affected them in later life. For the analyses, we started off with about 30 a priori codes that were developed from the literature, and now we're also developing some emergent codes as we move through our interviews. Okay, results. This is what you really want to see. So first off, I think that we analyze these data from the Understanding America survey rather, with the 140 adults who indicated that they were homeschooled at some point. And what you can see here is that this idea of once homeschooled, always homeschooled maybe doesn't possibly make a whole lot of sense. So if you look here, about 45% of adults who were homeschooled, they did it for 1 to 2 years. So nearly half of people are just kind of short-term homeschoolers. So I guess the first thing here is, keep in mind, it's just 140 people, but it is interesting here to see that you have pretty wide variation in the length of time that someone is homeschooled. And then of course, only 11% of this 140 respondents did so for 10 to 12 years. So I think this is kind of interesting. If you are assuming in an analysis that the practice is static, it may not be. Okay, so then we ran some logistic regressions to kind of understand what some of the associations might be between those who were homeschooled for longer periods of time relative to the short-term homeschoolers. So if you look at the first line here, you have substantial homeschooling, 3 to 9 years. Okay, so substantial homeschoolers relative to short-term homeschoolers who did so for just 1 to 2 years. So on what you can see on this first line, so household income, higher ed attendance, divorce, separated status, there's no statistical differences here. That's probably partly also related to just we're dealing with a really small sample here. But you can also see that these are odds ratios that you're looking at. They're small, very small associations, suggesting that there isn't much of a difference between the substantial homeschooler and the short-term homeschooler. So the substantial homeschooler is about 1.2 times more likely to have a household income above 50,000 relative to the short-term homeschooler. They're a little less likely to report some college education, although it's almost 1, so they're nearly the same. And they're a little less likely to report being divorced or separated. Let's look at the long-term homeschoolers. So same thing, they're about 1.2 times more likely to report a household income over $50,000 relative to the short-term homeschoolers. They're a little more likely to attend higher ed, and pretty much the same on the divorce separated status. But again, let me just reiterate, none of these are statistically significant. So there's really, what we can say is there's doesn't seem to be much of a difference here between the three groups. Just a quick sidebar. You'll notice I ever attended private school. That was the proxy for socioeconomic status during childhood that I used. And that seems to be a pretty good indicator of SES during childhood. So you can see here, those are some pretty large odds ratios there. So if the respondent reported having ever attended private school, they're about 2.3 times more likely, and that is statistically significant. So 2.3 times more likely to have a household income over $50,000, and nearly 6 times more likely to say that they've attended higher ed, and then much less likely to report being divorced or separated, but that's not statistically significant. Okay, so maybe I guess, at least in my view, perhaps the most interesting part of this study has been the qualitative part thus far. So as I mentioned, we've done 8 interviews so far. We have many more planned. So you kind of have to take these preliminary findings with a grain of salt. I don't know how they're going to change, but this is what we have so far. So across these different groups, right, the short term, the long term, the substantial, there's not a lot of evidence that homeschooled, so adults who were homeschooled, there's not a lot of evidence that at least they feel they were socially isolated. So they report a whole wide array of both sort of conventional and unconventional activities and social participations. And at least with these first 8 interviews, they report considerable social participations as adults as well. So that part's sort of interesting. There does seem to be this phenomenon where if you were homeschooled throughout your entire K-12 education, that when you then go on to university, there's this kind of initial culture shock and some sort of surprises about how kind of peers interact and those sorts of things. But that seems to dissipate pretty quickly. So in other words, this long-term homeschooler seems to adjust rather rapidly. Another interesting part of this that's come out is that the homeschoolers also sort of consistently, at least these 8 report that they felt like they had other adjustment skills. So having to do independent work as homeschoolers during their K-12 education, they felt like that had prepared them to do independent work in college and university, especially when they kind of compared themselves to their peers. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so maybe this set of findings here are the most important for this study. So the preliminary evidence that we're finding so far is that individual age and individuals' personalities and interests are pretty major factors that seem to be maybe influencing the length of time that a person is homeschooling. So if you look at, let's just take the role of personality for a minute. So if you look within the same family, I've talked to people who, as children, they began to kind of desire some of the more formal organizational structures of schools, some of the more formal social opportunities that you can find at school, and they kind of opted out. Whereas they might have siblings who were perfectly satisfied with what they were doing as a homeschooled student and the extracurriculars that they had, and didn't really desire those more formal structures. And so they stayed in homeschooling. And so this is within the same family. So there's this kind of child-driven selection mechanism that may be happening, which I think is pretty interesting. Age seems to be a factor, at least in the US context. As students grow older, the allure, for example, of some of those more formal structures, you can think of like going to, at least in the US context, going to football games, going to prom, participating in organized sports. So that seems to be an allure for a lot of homeschooled students, and then that may lead them to exit out of homeschooling. And so that was the case in some of the interviews that I've done. And so you kind of have this self-selection based on these individual characteristics that may be driving exit out of homeschooling, or whether someone decides to stay in homeschooling. And that seems to be kind of this conversation between the individual student themselves as well as the family. And in a sense, this might actually partly explain why you kind of see little difference based on length of time homeschool, because you have kind of individuals making decisions for themselves that kind of serve different interests at different times for different people. Okay, so let's wrap this up. So in a sense, homeschooled children, you might say they're isolated from an important mainstream institution, a brick and mortar school. And so the worry is that they're going to be overall, that they're going to be socially isolated, and this is going to harm them later on down the road. And so you might imagine that those who are homeschooled for longer periods of time, then they're going to experience more of the harm. But in this study, I don't find any evidence of this with this modest survey sample. And based on some of the preliminary qualitative interviews, don't see any evidence of this. But we'll see if it holds up when we do more interviews. But that's where we're at now. A couple of limitations. There are a number with this study, but I'll just point out it's a small survey with a pretty parsimonious set of controls. And thus far, again, the qualitative analysis is based on a modest set of interviews. At the same time, I think this study has the potential to add to the homeschooling literature, especially the literature that may not indicate so well that homeschooling really it isn't such a static practice, that there is sort of this common entry and exit in and out of homeschooling. Another potential contribution of this study is that kind of demonstrates little difference in the 3 life outcomes that we looked at based on length of time homeschooled. And then finally, this sort of idea that individual and family decisions to kind of that drive exit or entry into homeschooling may actually serve different needs for different children in different ways. And maybe that's why you kind of see a wash when you compare adults based on their life outcomes, because maybe they made the decisions that suited them at the time. But future work, I think, would be needed to look at this possibility with more analyses, better methods, those sorts of things to see if this is in fact the case. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dan, for that. And again, I just want to remind folks that if you do have questions, feel free to, even during the presentation, type them into the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. And, I'll certainly ask the questions, some right after the speaker speaks, but also save the majority of them for the discussion period that we're going to have at the end of the end of all the presentations. So with that being said, let's move on to our next speaker, Emily Coady, who will present some of her work.
Thank you, Albert.
Turn over the time to Dorcas, who will, we've been alluding to COVID and what that might do for homeschooling and education. And so Dorcas is going to tell us about what she's learning in Bolivia, I believe. So Dorcas, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Albert. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you, Debra. I think it was last year when I participated first at the GHX conferences, and specifically heard about the research track. And I remember my first time in the meetings, in the Zoom meetings, when I was posting in the chat, "Hi, I'm from Bolivia. Anyone interested in investigating us? Anyone want to research us?" And now I kind of laugh about it, because I was like looking for someone to do the job for us. And then I realized everyone was researching themselves. And I was like, oh, wow, we have to change everything we were thinking about this thing. So we began writing, and of course we made lots of mistakes on the way, but I'm pretty happy with some of the findings. So in research, there are some phenomena that force us to ask ourselves, if not now, then when? And this is the perfect time to study this particular phenomenon, which is families migrating to homeschooling due to COVID pandemic quarantine. And in this particular study, we didn't want to prove anything. We were doing this the old way. We wanted to learn. And some of the things we asked ourselves, some of the questions we had were, how important is the accompaniment of the peers in the process of migration from one system to the other? In other words, if the coaching we as a social association in Bolivia provide for families is an important piece of the decision to homeschool their kids, or on the contrary, it's not important. Another question we had was the perceptions of education and learning. Will those change in time due to homeschooling? And we couldn't measure that because it turns out that 6 months was a very short period of time. We realized that we needed to gather basic information as an association to begin with, who we are, how many are we, where do we come from, and that's the orientation of others to this previous to this one that were related, the baseline. And also to analyze, we need to analyze the legislative framework of the region to find out where our country was in terms of respect for educational choice. And then we realized we needed a Catt study that provided basic information about our beliefs and our attitudes and our some practices that are working and some that are not. And the Catt study is mentioned in this one. So then came this group of COVID parents, and just to give a little context to our kind audience, Homeschooling Bolivia as an association began in 2018. 6 families began the adventure, and in less than 1 year, we jumped from 6 families to 200. But during this pandemic, our open communication channel, which is a Facebook group, jumped from 200 to 2,000 people, 2,500 people. So you know, as we do, that not all of them are homeschooling, but that shows the interest and the need of for information that they had, mostly due to pandemic. So there was a lot of questions and a lot of families, and along came this group, and there were like 50 families that they said, particularly coaches, we're going to move to homeschooling, so coaches, we need to change. And there was something else that I will mention in the context. So from these 50 people, 18 participated in our study, which is a very humble sample compared to your 3,000, Emily, which I envy so much. But these are the first studies in Bolivia. There's nothing written about homeschooling before this in Bolivia, nothing, not even a definition of what it is or who does it. There was nothing, so we had to start from scratch. So the context of our study is the pandemic and the quarantine particularly. And at the moment of the measurement, which is, and I will explain this too, November 1st, we were already going down in our curve. 76 cases in that day of measurement. And we were having another thing that was the crisis of the traditional education system. And this is the political part that I wanted to show. This is part of the context. Our school year, traditional school year, begins in February, and ends in November, maybe sometimes some years December. But this year, they closed the school year in July. So it was an early closing of the year, and this was highly criticized by teachers and parents, and it was due to pandemic. They couldn't do it. And in August 2nd, the Constitutional Chamber of the Justice Court had a popular hearing. People wanted to complain about the closure, about online education, which was a disaster. Most of some of the talks that we've been sharing today, like Coady's, and also some of the things that were said this morning in other presentations, people in schools, they didn't know what they were doing, so they were lost. And in August 3rd, the closure was ratified in all modalities, arguing health interest and difficulties in carrying out online education for teachers and schools. So this is a longitudinal study. It's a type of research. You must know that it's a study it's used to study evolution of a social phenomena over time. We have borrowed it from medicine, and it wants to measure a phenomenon during a specific time interval, and to analyze and observe sequentially the evolution of the phenomena. We want detailed information and the change process. And it's a retrospective because we didn't analyze data until we finished all the measurements. And that's to some deviation in the study. And it's also accelerated because we only had 6 months commitment with the families. That was what the families agreed to. When we went to the families and said, okay, we will coach you. Can you help us with this study? They said, okay, we cannot commit farther than 6 months. And it was true. We saw it in the participation, how it dropped in the end. So to analyze the facts can help us to predict some things. So the data of this short investigation, we had 3 repetitions to observe the phenomena. The observed people were the group of parents whose children were migrating from traditional school model to homeschooling. The time points were 6 months in total, with 2 months between measurements. And the response profile showed the trend that most parents prefer to stay in homeschooling model despite everything. We had a variation effect, which is a cohort effect and period effect that affected our study. So these are our research questions. Is coaching an important element in the decision to homeschool? And this was kind of mean. Will they succeed if left unaided? So we had a period of 2 months in which we did not connect with them. We did not send them any YouTube videos, any word, nothing. It was a total, complete silence. And after that, the answers came from them. The second measurement took place. And what do they think about education and learning right now? What will they think in 2 months and in 6 months? This is a qualitative and exploratory study, in a non-synchronic study. And it was a convenient sample. It was a group we had access to. There's some of the basis, and well, there were some limitations, of course. Participation of families dropped dramatically over time. Although this is an expected effect, it limited the final response of the group. The sample was very small, and we had these implications. The first one, this is why we did not read the results of the investigation until past October, because we didn't want to contaminate the second measurement with the results of the first. We didn't want to feel temptation to change the questions because something we found out in the first measurement. So that's how we handled the first implication. And the second implication, which is about the control of the person, some aspects that are out of the control of the person who's investigating the phenomena. Then we realized in the end that it was the affectation was minimal because 2 of the 3 variables can be controlled. Our variables were the accompaniment, the COVID parents education concept, and the children's experience of how they perceive the change of modality in the pandemic. And our goals were to determine if the coaching is important or not, and what concepts the group have, and discover the perception of children. The tools were 2 online surveys. We did this online because we were in quarantine. We could not move anywhere, and most of them are in different regions. Let me show you just that. This is one of the first results, and so you can see this in blue. That's Santa Cruz City. It's not the city where I am at. I am actually in the green city. And so people were from 4 big cities. These 3 big cities in Bolivia are called Central Axis. So the most populated and most important. La Paz is the seat of the government. Santa Cruz is the economical motor of Bolivia, and Cochabamba is in the middle of everything. So these are the central cities and the most populated too. And that's related to the accompaniment and the coaching, because the fact that the group were actually in different cities was a complication of the coaching itself. So we also asked them what reasons did they have to change from traditional school to homeschooling. And as you can see here, almost 40% of them said the pandemic, but there's also the group who said economical reasons. And this is related to the fact that most of them were in private school. most of them were in bilingual private schools, and they didn't like what their school were doing with online education. And they came to the moment of asking themselves, why am I paying so much money for this? It's not working. So they decided to try homeschooling. And we asked them if they were using some kind of platform, because we wanted to measure whether they were open to receive help or not. This also could show us their understanding of what is homeschooling. And 90% said no. Now, this also has an explanation, because they were coming from a very bad experience with school platforms, with the so-called online education. So their experience with the school platforms was so bad that they thought it can do no harm that I don't use any platform at all for homeschooling. And we tried to explain, these are people, homeschooling platforms, that are in this business for 50 years, 25 years online. So they know what they're doing, but it was no use. They stayed there because that was part of the coaching. So we asked them about, because our variable 3 was trying to find out what are the emotional response of children. And so we asked them, how do they see the children after 2 months of not online school or campus school? It was already, quarantine began in March in Bolivia, and this was taken in September. So they see their children happier, more relaxed, more creative, more friendly. Also, some of them said that they saw their children stressed, confused, but more obedient, some disobedient, and annoying. That was a small response. To verify the process over time for this particular issue, the same question was asked in the second and in the last measurement, taking into account that the first measurement had been taken in July, and the answers remain similar to the figure here that I show you. It refers to the experience of quarantine. It's important because children could be rejecting homeschooling model. That was the hypothesis, because of the quarantine. If they felt that the homeschooling model was depriving them of contact with their peers and friends, they could reject homeschooling. However, findings point in another direction. The kids, despite missing social interaction with their friends, they were happy to remain in homeschooling. And their claims refer more to the quarantine and the impossibility to go out and play or things like that. So this is the last measurement, and we asked them, in these 2 months, did you abandon your school, traditional or an online school? Do your children miss school? Some say this green is yes, blue is no, and yellow is only the friends, not school. They miss their friends. So there's a lot of people. And also this response can be misinterpreted by children's need to protect their parents, because children saw from the first hand what they were going through. Some people lost their jobs, their business, they could not pay for the very expensive school. So children could be also lying about this. So we asked again in the third measurement, what do you miss, or what does your children miss? What do they miss about school? And they said their friends, socialization, his companions, his teachers or her teachers. However, parents also report that they are the ones who believe that lack of interaction is one of the problems they face in homeschooling. So it's possible that this report is more an interpretation of parents as a children's problem. That's why we asked the children to draw their experience. This way we could cross all information and see what was it. The girl who made this drawing was answering the question, how do I feel now that I study from home? And that was part of a package of questions and instructions that we sent to the parents. And that didn't work because only a very few people sent us the answers. So this is Andrea. And as you can see, I love this drawing. She said, I feel bored. I'm bored at home. And so we can see some drawings like those in this study. This was an attempt to muscle response from parents in the last measurement, trying to ask their children what do they miss from traditional system. And also the answers did not coincide with the parents' observation of the children happier and more relaxed. That could be, they could be happy and they could also miss their friends at school. The interesting part about this is the parents express that they will continue to homeschool anyway, even though after the 2-month period of silence, complete silence, and after whatever problems they have with the children, because they did have problems adapting to the new system. So the data shows that coaching is important, but even without it, families have positive experiences. Families, even without any support for 2 months, had good experiences. They said, definitely it made me meet my children, know them more. It has been a very nice experience to share with my child in a different way and know each other better. Beyond the academics, we could influence them in a very positive way in their character and values. It is a challenge, but I will not let it. I love to be with my child 100%, to share and learn and love each other, knowing our strengths and weaknesses. In God's will, I will not leave homeschooling until they graduate. In the second measurement, we specifically asked parents if they were disappointed on the experience after 2 months of silence. And they were disappointed on the quarantine. They're not relating with their companions, they're missing their classmates, few social interactions, and also they are disappointed on their own accomplishment. Mom does not have any more time for her now. The parents' undoing of school worldview is hard. I have very little time to evaluate. It's complicated for me. I have not studied in a professional way these things. And they have achievements. They say that they see the children, their self-taught, that they have, their relationship has grown because they spend more time together, that they can guide and reinforce whatever the kids need, that they have an effective advance, that they see the children more confident. They also had some failures, which are again related to their own role as tutors of the children. They say, I lost time because I wasn't experienced. I feel lonely and there's no interaction with other people. Other person said, we don't know how to teach them. We don't know if we're doing the right thing. Other person said, I have to become organized. I have to prepare the material and I can't. So these responses, these answers are very similar to those given by parents who were homeschooling before the pandemic, and they were not forced to migrate to homeschooling. And the fact that they voluntarily change, it makes a big difference in the way the family assumes the changes and adapt. But we never had the chance to measure these things, to record them, or we never thought that we could do that. So families clearly manifest some advantages and achievements they have. And when it comes to failure, they tend to take the responsibility for their failure. And we think this is the result of training in the traditional paradigm, where teaching depends on who teaches and almost nothing on who learns. And also explains the trend of schooling the home, turning their home into a school, transferring school dynamics and routines to the home, trying to reproduce the model known as school, which in the other study, the Catt caused them to fail at some point. The Catt study found that these families confused the concept of education with school itself. So for them, they were like the same. Therefore, if they consider school to be education, that would explain their problems and disappointments, because when they start homeschooling, they try to turn their homes into a school. And since there are different models and paradigms, they fail and they fight their children who oppose them. And this graphic shows the starting point of the perception of homeschoolers without the support. This is the measurement of the 2 months. And there's a rise, the red scale, the red line, it means I'm not disappointed. And it begins in a high point because most of them said in another question that they were excited about beginning homeschool their kids. And it rises again, and it comes down because of the small participation in the third measurement. And the blue line is disappointed, as you can see, starts low, goes down. They're not disappointed at all. And a bit in the last measurement because of the problems they face. But they are, I explained already that they are not disappointed on homeschooling, they're disappointed on themselves mostly. They blame themselves for things that are not working. And happier children, you can see the curve I love this curve. Very, very low, it is very low. And by the second measurement, it almost goes as high as the not disappointed. So children are happier. And this is after the 2 months of silence. So this means that they were not seeing other homeschoolers in any activity that we programmed. This means that they were not having any help. They were just being at home with their parents. They were happier. And this is not the quarantine. So quarantine began earlier, like here, and we measured this here. This is after they left the school system, the online school system, and began to homeschool. So the rank of happiness just jumped up. So the cohort effect was the political cohort effect is something that affects the entire group. And this particular group was part of an association that was fighting the government because of the school fees. So that affected their vision and perception, not only of themselves, but of teaching and learning process phenomena, because since they were complaining to government, they felt like it was government responsibility for educated children, while in homeschooling, most responsibilities in parents' hands or the children's. So that was a cohort effect. And the pandemic was the period effect because it changed the way these families experience homeschool from the beginning. Not only the economic depression due to the inability to attend their work or loss of their businesses and jobs, but also the stress and mental depression of the confinement affected the perception of the families. However, even with both effects on top, families reported good experiences with homeschooling and the decision to remain in this form of learning. However, the possible scenario next year. So to close of this, we found some things like the time range was very short. The appropriation of a new paradigm and concept cannot be measured in 6 months as education as a process. We know intuitively that it existed, but we could not record it due to last measurement for participation. Certain things we could not measure. The Catt study was complementary to this, and we are sharing this with the parents. I want to show you this timeline just quickly to finish. This is the first measurement, and the context of it is the quarantine. This is the second measurement, and the context of it is the early closing of the year. This is the third measurement, and its context is the fight, the constitutional fight of the decision of the government, and then we had to close the study. So very stressful situations were happening in each of the measurements that we took, which were not under our control. But anyway, families report good results. So we found in the Catt study that they need to abandon old paradigm and embrace a new one, and that's the importance of the coaching, because otherwise they wear. So if they have a mixed concept in their minds about school and education, then they have bad practices at home, and they reject the same model because it doesn't work, and so they fail and they feel frustrated and there's conflict, and then they tend to abandon the system. On the contrary, when they receive sufficient support and advice to make the necessary adjustments, they are able to abandon the old paradigm and embrace a new way of teaching and learning and adjust their concepts, knowing that this will favor their children in their learning. That's not easy. That's not an easy thing. That this morning, Michael was saying that. McDonald was saying that it's not an easy thing for any family to change this way when everything, all your life has been a different path. So also homeschooling community and Coady parents share a past in concept. They share things. We wanted to compare them. We wanted so much to compare homeschooling parents and Coady parents. From the concept and attitudes, practices are born, effective or not, that lead to academic success or school failure. So even though there's not a defined systematization, because there's a high degree of personalization in homeschooling, there are common ground terms to review. So every member of the homeschooling community has traveled the same path. Some authors call it, they call it in Spanish desescolarización, which is not unschooling. It's like the undoing of school. It's a paradigm shift. And so I want to show you that, to end that with my presentation. These are the parent copies in green, and these are homeschoolers, they're all homeschoolers because we measured this in the Catt study. They both began with education and school are the same concept, and this transition to education as a right. They both began with learning as a dependence model, and this one transitioned to learning as an autonomy exercise. They both began to turn their houses into schools, and these ones now think that homeschooling is freedom. And they both began with the focus in who teaches, and this was now the focus in who learns. And our recommendations are that we need more time to study the children's reactions. We couldn't cover that.
Thank you, Dorcas. And just real quick, I think we have a request for you to actually make the study available in Spanish as well. So is it available?
It was reading in Spanish. I had to translate.
Yeah, okay. So I'm sure if
it-
you're curious about this, you should be able to follow up with Dorcas to get a copy of that. So anyway, last but not least, we have Drew, who's going to talk about the COVID experience here in the US and its bearing on how parents are providing for their kids' education. So Drew, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And presentations so far have been fascinating. As a former homeschool student myself, I was homeschooled grades 1 through 5. Albert and Dan, if y'all are interested in any additional research subjects for your qualitative interviews, please let me know. And I also still still friends and acquaintances with quite a few folks from my homeschool group and other homeschoolers that I've met along the way. But I am not here to talk about my experience being a homeschool student. I am here to share some of the findings from our national poll about what the public and K-12 parents think about homeschooling. So caveat, this is brand new. I actually just finished all of the graphics last week. So this is research that will be coming out sometime in the month of December. So all that being said, please do not share externally yet. But yeah, if you're interested, check out our website or subscribe. And yeah, this will be coming out, I believe, to a week or two before Christmas. So with that, really, it's getting into the poll itself. And even though Albert did talk about ed choice at the beginning, just wanted to point out that yes, our mission is universal choice. So anyone being able to access any type of schooling environment, regardless of where they live or how much money their family makes. So digging into the survey itself, so the majority of the results that I will be sharing are from September 30th to October 19th. And I do touch on some of the results from our first wave, which was May 22nd to June 1st. So this is a national sample.
Thanks, Drew, for presenting that data. Fascinating stuff. Lots of questions we might ask about that. So again, just a reminder to everybody that if you have any questions, to please go ahead and type them into the Q&A box, and we'll get them answered, or as many as we can with the time we have left. So anyway, let me just kick off with a few that have been raised here, and some, and just to rope us into a larger discussion with all the panelists. So I guess one, I'll start with, I get to ask my own question because I'm running the session, so maybe I'll start for myself. So I noticed that both in Dorcas and Drew's data, there were some data points about homeschool families and homeschooled children responding with feeling less stressed and feeling happier. And so I'm gonna make you speculate. Actually, maybe I'm making Drew speculate more since he did a high level poll. But Dorcas, certainly you're more closely connected with a lot of the families that are homeschooling. Yeah, could you contextualize that a bit? So what is it that's driving this? And is this something that's specific only to the pandemic, or is there a broader trend that we're identifying here?
You said I can answer.
Yeah, you're
I'd
good,
like
Dorcas.
Drew to answer because I think I took more of his time.
No, it's all right. You're good.
But I would guess it's the relationship. I think the children were aching for more face-to-face time with their parents, which we cannot provide when we are working 12 hours a day to pay for the very, very expensive private schools. So I think it was relationship most of all. And also, especially here, we heard about the pandemic in January. And as an association, we designed a plan to reach out to society. And we went into social media a lot. And we told them, you need to secure the relationship. Academics will come later, but secure the relationship. So people tend to obey social media and TV advice. So we did good in that. And for most children, it was a good thing because we said from time and now they won't remember, oh, I remember that during the quarantine, I learned multiplication tables or whatever. They will say, I remember my parents telling me that everything was going to be okay. I remember visiting my grandparents or such. So I think it was the relationship. That would be my guess.
Drew, could you speculate based on what else in your data that might explain that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have anything in my data. I can only pull from my own personal experience. So for me, like when I was growing up, the one thing about homeschooling was I still wanted to play and interact with my peers, which I didn't get to do on that often of a basis. So here, what a lot of the millennials and Gen Z call FOMO, which is the fear of missing out. There was a lot less fear of missing out, especially in the months of April, May, June here in America. So I can only say that myself, when I was a homeschool student, that would have made me, I guess, happier, less stressed. And also kind of what Dorcas was getting at, like, I wouldn't have just had one parent at home. I would have had two parents at home. And the bonding time that I would have been able to get with my parent who was typically working a 9 to 5 would have been amazing.
Maybe just to pick on Dan's expertise here. So Dan, I know you do a lot of work in school safety. And so certainly simply looking at the results from, at least my perception, from putting separate questions from Drew's survey together. So homeschool families being mostly concerned about safety, and then also juxtaposing that with the fact that they seem to be happier. Is this, do we have some evidence to speak into this? I mean, you've looked into school safety and whether that might have any bearing on some of the findings that we see here.
Good question. I mean, that's the first time I've seen a poll like that asking homeschoolers about safety. I know they've been done previously, but it's the first time I've seen it. So it makes sense to me. I have in some work heard from homeschoolers that was one of the rationales. one of the rationales. I mean, in Drew's poll, I think there's a number of different rationales that are listed. So yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense, but it also sounds like there's many rationales that they highlight. So that also makes sense too, I suppose. But I had a question for Drew, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Go ahead.
One thing that was kind of interesting was that the private school families were most positive on the district-run public schools. And I was just wondering, I mean, if you're willing to speculate why you think that might be, because on the one hand, they're paying, assuming that they don't have like a voucher or an ESA or anything like that, they're paying to attend a private school, but at the same time, they're the group that's most positive about the district-run public schools. Or did I miss something there in your poll, or does that sound about right?
I'm not recalling which slide. I apologize.
It was near the end. I think it was much higher than any other group. So anyway, I just that just sort of stood out to me. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot and force you to speculate, but I was just kind of curious about that.
Oh, so that was the direction of K-12 education in America. So that's not sector specific. It's just overall in what direction is K-12 education in America heading?
I see. Okay, that makes a little more sense. I guess it depends on how the respondent understood K through 12 education.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because it's interesting that the homeschoolers kind of saw it as a negative thing, but ostensibly they weren't reflecting on their own practice at home.
Whereas the private school parents may have been reflecting more on what their experience with the private schools.
Yeah, maybe that's what explains it. Yeah.
So we do have a question from Patricia Lee, and I think she was asking in response to Emily. I don't know if, well, I'll just throw it to Emily, and maybe we're going to have to bug Drew again because he knows these kinds of things. He's the one with polling data over time. So I guess the question is homeschooling actually becoming more common to children with or without special needs? Yeah, is there anything in the data, I suppose, Emily, that might reflect on, might speak into that, or maybe we'll have Drew chime in too to see what he might observe in some of his polling.
I would definitely defer to Drew. I will just say that I haven't seen anything that specifically looks at the difference between families with special needs students and families who don't have special needs students. It's usually those general motivators, religious education, school safety, non-traditional approach to education, but that would be a really fascinating poll if it does not already exist.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the answer would be, but I think the best way to get an answer along those lines is to look at the estimates of homeschoolers across time, and then also dig into the IDEA Part B child count data. That if you really dive into the nitty-gritty state level data files, you can see actually by disability where the child is being educated. So you could aggregate all of the educated at home and look at that proportionally over time versus the number of look at that over time against the number of homeschoolers to look at proportionally how many homeschoolers.
So that basically is a free research idea for anybody to take up, and be interesting to count that to get some sense. Yeah.
I mean, so there's a bigger question here, right? And I think it's sort of the fundamental question for homeschool scholarship going forward, in my view, and that is research on homeschooling that actually effectively disaggregates homeschoolers based on their rationales for homeschooling, right? So when you're aggregating up a homeschool sample and within it you have 15% have done so because their children have severe disabilities and that's why they're homeschooling, and maybe another percent are doing it because their kids are, their IQs put them at genius level, what are you actually looking at the means? Right. So I think there's some potentially really good research to be done that could come up with some kind of way of classifying homeschoolers, and then that would aid in sort of more nuanced analyses where homeschoolers, maybe with a series of dummy variables and some kind of classification system, if you're able to do that, then you could come up with, you know, some, I think, better analyses of what homeschooling, you know, what it does, what it's trying to do, and what its associations are with, you know, different sets of outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And of course, that's a total plug for some of the motivation in our work here. So, but I do think that's an important question to disentangle here. So, Deb, you had a question?
Yeah, I do. I think it maybe plays into what Dan just was talking about. So I homeschooled in the early 80s, and the option of school safety wasn't even one of the motivations on the list we were given. So I find this data so fascinating that school safety is so predominant now as a motivation for homeschooling. And I even saw, Drew, in your slides there that homeschoolers listed a fear of you know, putting their kid back in school. And I thought that was related to maybe COVID. I mean, do you think in the school safe, two questions here. One, do you think in your data that the school safety response has concerns about COVID exposure in that data? And then a bigger question is, what's going on like with those homeschoolers? That was not my motivation at all. But it seems so predominant today. Like, what is going on with that group of homeschool families that are saying, I'm concerned about the safety of my child?
Yeah, so the first question was the actual question was, how comfortable do you feel with your child returning to school? So that was specific to COVID that they answered, not at all comfortable. And then when it came to reasons for choosing the safety, that's something that we've seen year after year. So I don't think that it necessarily was COVID keyed, but again, like it could have spilled in. And yeah, as I'm trying to just think of, like, I mean, my parents' safety was one of the reasons my parents chose to homeschool me. And yeah, I definitely see for my mom that the COVID would have just way exponentially increased that feeling. So I don't, yeah, I would hypothesize that there are new families choosing safety as a reason, and that there have always been families choosing safety as a reason, and safety may be a more pronounced reason, or either higher up their list or just larger in their reasoning, especially in like light of COVID.
Yeah, I just think there could be some complexity right there to what do you mean by safety? Like, was it bullying? Was it, you know, from a teachers? Was it from peers? Was it, you know, risk of illness? You know, was it gun violence? You know, what is kind of, you know, the expanded understanding of that motivation? But and I think you're probably a generation after me. I am early 80s homeschooling. And then I think in the 90s is when it started to show up on the list of motivating factors. So thanks.
I guess there's a question which I'll field myself. So Patricia's asking, do you have information of which countries do not permit homeschooling? And for that, I'd refer you to actually maybe Debra's more well-versed in this. There's a resource that GHEX has, right, to identify that?
Yes, and it's on the HSLDA website under international. You can see a very elaborated list of countries around the world, what their homeschool population is, and what the laws currently are. If I were to generalize, I think homeschooling freedom is growing around the world in most regions. The most problematic area is Western Europe. There is more clear making it illegal or clear obstacles. We'll be talking about France, especially during this conference, but that's what GHEX does. We're working to help national leaders make homeschooling create favorable conditions for families to have an option to homeschool wherever they may be in the world.
And Dorcas, you had something to add?
Yeah, I don't have information about Europe or Asia or the rest of the world. I have information about Latin America. And there's a lot of legal voids. Actually, only 2 countries, 3 if you count Ecuador, have homeschooling, specific homeschooling regulations. Bolivia is one of them, just recently approved. But the point is, those legal voids do not, most of the homeschooling communities have been moving in those voids, thinking that they were kind of good for them. We are not seen and we're not caught. We're not breaking the law or anything. But it turns out that it doesn't matter if you have a good regulation or a legal void if your government is kind of persecutory to the family. Because since homeschooling happens in the family, if you have a government that is kind of not nice to families, it doesn't matter anyway if you have any kind of regulation. That came out from the sondeo that we had with Latin American national leaders, and some of them don't have regulations, or some of them have friendly regulations, but that are listed as friendly regulations in HSLDA website. But still, their experience is different because of the tendency of the government. That's very sad, but that's what's happening to them.
Thanks. And so that looks like we've exhausted all the existing questions there. So I think I'll take the prerogative to thank the panelists again for sharing their work. You can certainly find their information if you'd like to follow up with them and have additional questions. So Dan, Drew, Dorcas, Emily, thank you very much for sharing what's going on. And I'd like to just encourage every other panelist or a participant to refer back to the website for our week together and check out some of the other research track presentations and sessions that are organized. So with that being said, thanks everybody, and good night or good afternoon or good morning if you were one of those brave people that woke up very early to watch us present this work. So thanks for joining us, and wish you all very well.